All right, for trigonometry, this is 5.7, and for pre-cal, this is found in 4.7. This lesson is on inverse trig functions. So inverse trig functions are going to be denoted with a little -1. The only other time you guys have seen this in this course is when we did SOHCAHTOA and we had to find the degree. We saw that little -1. But now we're going to work on it in general with the whole unit circle. And when we work with these questions, I want you to think of this as a game of Jeopardy. Okay? Did I spell that right? No, there's an A in there somewhere, right? Oh my goodness. Well, you know what I mean. It's Jeopardy. This is why I'm a math teacher. So it's a game of Jeopardy, okay? And in Jeopardy, they always give you the answer and you have to come up with a question. All right? So the same's going to happen here. In the past, I would have asked you a question of like, what is cosine of 3 pi over 4? And at 3 pi over 4, you would go to the x value and you tell me the cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative radical 2 over 2. So now I'm going to say the word inverse in front of cosine, and I'm going to give you the answer, and you're going to give me the question. So I would say, what is the inverse cosine of negative radical 2 over 2? And you would tell me 3 pi over 4, or you can give me the degrees, which is 135 degrees. Okay? So here are the main rules that you need to memorize. Okay? For cosine, right here in parentheses, you only look at the top half of the unit circle, and of course cosine is the x values. So the moment you hear the words inverse cosine, or you see that notation, you were looking at the top half, and then you can see I marked in red only the x values. Okay? All right, now when we work with inverse sine and tangent, okay, notice my arrow goes to this side of my paper. We work with the right side of the unit circle. And notice the signs are the y values, which I marked in green, okay, all along the right side. And then my tangents, I marked in orange, are my y over x, or some of you remember it as sine divided by cosine. So I took a moment and I did the work for the sine divided by cosine for the entire right side. And boxed off in orange are your tangents for all of those spots. Okay? So make sure you have this written down in your notes. I'm going to ask you a set of questions now of inverse. The moment you hear sine, right side, y's. The moment you hear cosine, top, x's. And the moment you hear tangent, right side, boxed off answers. Okay, I will give you the answers. You will give me the radian or degree. Okay, so let's look at these 9 questions. Okay, let's do one of each together. Inverse sine of 0. The moment you hear inverse sine, you go to the right side and you look at the y values. Which one of these y values has a 0 in it? You guys see it right there? See how the y value on the right side has a 0 on this spot? What is my radian and degree on this spot? Good, so you can answer 0 radians or 0 degrees. Okay? Let's go across. Inverse cosine of -1. You hear the word inverse cosine, so you look at the top half of your unit circle and you look at the x values. Find in those x values where there is a -1. You guys see it right here on the left? Okay, and that spot as a radian is called pi, and as a degree, 180 degrees. Okay, again, I will accept either of those 2 answers. And now tangent. Inverse tangent, okay, which means I'm looking at the right side of the unit circle at the division. So on this right side of the unit circle, all of these boxed off answers, look for -1. Okay, I also remember that tangent is negative on the bottom half. So on the bottom half, I see my negatives. There's -1, and that belongs to negative pi over 4 and negative 45 degrees. Okay? Now remember that your unit circle, when we're looking at the right side, because we don't have the entire unit circle, these values go backwards. So it's the same as this quadrant 1, just negative and in reverse, okay? All right, take a moment and try and do the other 6 on your own. All right, so inverse sine of negative 1. I look at the right side, and I look where the y value is negative 1, and hopefully your eyes were directed down here. Okay? So hopefully you answered negative pi over 2 or negative 90 degrees. Okay? I'm going to complete the other sign. Inverse sine, again, still looking at the right side. I'm looking for where my y value is negative radical 3 over 2. I know sine is negative on the bottom. Negative radical 3 over 2 in green for inverse sine is right here. So my answer is negative pi over 3 or negative 60 degrees. Okay? Next, my 2 inverse cosines, which leads me looking at the top, the x values. I have positive cosines on the right side. So here I see radical 2 over 2 at pi over 4, or we can call that 45 degrees. And radical 3 over 2 is right next to it. It is at pi over 6, or 30 degrees. All right, the last 2, I'm looking at inverse tangent, which means I'm looking at the right side at the answers of my division. Tangent is positive on the top. Radical 3 over 3 is right here, which belongs to pi over 6 or 30 degrees. And lastly, inverse tangent, when it's negative, it should be on the bottom. I see negative radical 3 here, which belongs to negative pi over 3 or negative 60 degrees. All right, so the next question should lead you to what happens if the value is not on the unit circle. And that's when you are allowed to use your calculator. Okay? So take a minute, take out your calculator, write those notes. So in our calculators, we are going to look for the little negative 1 in the exponent. Okay? Make sure your calculator is on radian mode. Got a little glare there. So when you click mode, we come to this screen and you can see that on the 4th row, I am currently on radians, and then second mode to go back to your home screen. Okay? So the inverse buttons are found by pressing seconds and then sine, cosine, and tangent. So again, if we look at our calculators, we have sine, cosine, and tangent right here, and above them, do you see the same sine, cosine, and tangent, but with a little negative 1 in the exponent? So all you have to do is press second and then any of those buttons. Okay? So take a moment in your calculator and put inverse tangent of negative 5.2, inverse cosine of 0.2, and inverse sine of 0.8. All right, so if you haven't had a moment to try this on your own, pause the video. But here we go with our answers. Okay? So here is what your calculator should look like. Your inverse tangent has a negative 1.38. Your inverse cosine has a 1.369. And your inverse sine has a 0.927. Okay? Remember, you only need to write the first 3 digits. If you are planning on taking AP Cal in the future, you get full credit for writing the first 3 digits without rounding. Okay? Let's write those answers in. Bless you. All right. All right, guys. So combination functions. Here's where we're going to have regular trig functions with inverse trig functions mixed up, okay? So for these questions, treat it like a composite function where you look at the inside first and then you solve the outside. So what is cosine of 2 pi over 3? Negative half. So I'm going to replace this entire inside with a negative 1/2. So now I could say, okay, inverse cosine of negative 1/2. All I did was change the inside to what the inside equaled. Okay? So I solved the inside. Now I'm going to solve the outside. Based on the notes today, inverse cosine means I'm looking at the top of the unit circle. When does cosine equal negative 1/2? Say it again. Nice. At 2 pi over 3 or 120 degrees. Okay? So there are times where your answer will end up being the same just because they had you look at the same spot. In the next question, we're going to see how it changes up sometimes. Okay? So look at your regular unit circle. When there's no inverse sign, we look at our regular unit circle. What is cosine of 4 pi over 3? It is also negative half. We all see that? That should be in your third quadrant. Okay? So again, I just solved the inside and replaced it. Now, this part is the same. What is inverse cosine of negative half? 2 pi over 3 or 120 degrees. Do you see that even though we started off with something different, we could end up with the same answer? Okay? So you're kind of just like, it's almost like a word search with your unit circle. You're just searching around, okay? All right. Tangent, we're working on the next one. We're working with the inside. 3 pi over 4 is in quadrant 2. What is my tangent at 3 pi over 4? It should be good. Negative 1. And now because this is an inverse tangent, I'm thinking backwards. So now for these, I look at the right side. My answers in my little boxes. When was tangent negative 1? Good. Negative pi over 4 or negative 45 degrees. Okay? So again, when I do not have an inverse sign, I look at my regular unit circle. When I do have an inverse sign, we look at the rules we learned today of either the top or the right side. So look at this next question. I switch it. I do the inverse first in the inside. So first, I'm working Jeopardy style. Inverse sign means I look at the right side. When on the right side, do I have a negative radical 2 over 2 in the y? Right. So negative pi over 4. You can write one of them here. You don't have to write them both. Okay? So now, in that same exact location at negative pi over 4, what is the secant? What was the rule for secant? It's flipping the cosine. Okay? So what do I get if I flip the cosine in that spot? Well, my cosine is negative radical 2 over 2. So if I flip it, I get negative 2 over radical 2. Okay? All I have left to do is rationalize this one. And I have negative 2 radical 2 over 2, which these 2's cancel, and my answer is negative radical 2. All right, and I just had a student correct me that cosine in quadrant 4 is positive, so thank you for that. So this should all just be positive. All right, let's look at this last question, okay? So what happens when the values are not in the unit circle? So if you refer back for trig to 5.3 and pre-cal 4.4, we learned that we can use our x, y, and r relationships, okay? So I'm going to start off still by working on the inside, okay? An inverse function means, okay, so just this inside part, means that tangent of theta equals 7 over 24. Okay? Because again, we're playing Jeopardy. They told us the answer to the tangent. Tangent was y over x. So I know that my y is 7 and my x is 24. My job now is to find my r. Now the final answer that they want me to figure out is sine. So I'm going to use the inside to solve for my x, y, and r to then be able to answer what sine is. Okay? Which sine is y over r. So I already have part of my answer. It's going to be 7 over whatever I find r to be. Okay? So my formula is that r equals the square root of x squared plus y squared. So I could say r equals square roots of 7 squared plus 24 squared. All right, so 7 squared is 49. 24 squared is 576. And then add those together and do the square roots. I'm doing the square root of 625, which equals 25. So this is my r. So again, I use the inside to solve for my x, y, and r, and then I apply that x, y, and r to my outside. So sine is y over r, so my final answer is my y, which is 7, over my r, which is 25.